March 5, 2002, 2:10 p.m., Newport, Oregon. A landline rings in a small house 2 blocks from the bayfront. The caller IDs as U.S. Navy and local police. A recovered aircraft needs a next of kin. Ruth Cross, 63, hears her son's name, Aidan Cross, lead singer of Silver Divide, missing since August 14, 1983, 6:32 p.m., after takeoff from Troutdale near Portland. What happened to Aidan? 19 years later, a deep water recovery will force a new investigation, new witnesses, and a new target. Not everyone on that flight reached the bottom. Some chose a different exit. One detail won't fit the old report. Ruth sets the phone down and writes the time. She confirms her identity and agrees to meet federal agents. The clock, long stopped, starts again. The Navy briefing is short. A survey sub picked up a metallic silhouette west of Lincoln County. Depth estimates place the wreck on the Cascadia Basin shoulder. Currents are favorable. The hull looks intact. She signs the consent forms and rides in the back of a government sedan. The drive north is quiet. Roadside spruce blur by. Agent Lena Park sits beside her and summarizes the original file. August 14, 1983, Silver Divide boarded a chartered light jet arranged by the band's manager, Martin Cross, Aidan's father. Flight plan showed a 1-hour sightseeing loop and a meeting with distribution representatives later that night. Weather was stable. Radio contact ceased at 6:47 p.m. No distress call. Coast Guard aircraft searched for 3 days. Divers searched inshore reefs. No debris field. No ELT ping. The Civil Air Patrol called it unlikely survivable. Families kept the photos and the flyers. The case drifted into the cold stack. At the Coast Guard pier in Astoria, Ruth sees it under floodlights. A narrow-body jet slung from a crane, kelp trailing like streamers. Salt has eaten the paint into dull patches. Windows show starburst fractures pointing inward. A door lever sits locked. Recovery techs speak in clipped phrases. The plane is whole enough to tell a story. A blue awning marks the identification line. 6 black bags rest on tarps, tagged and numbered. A pathologist briefs families before the reveal. There will be no graphic discussion. Items will be used for preliminary IDs only. When the zipper slides on the first, an assistant lifts a guitar strap with a custom inlay and a belt with a hammered silver buckle. A wallet holds a worn photo and a name. Jamie Klein, 23, rhythm guitar. The second zipper reveals a bright patterned trouser leg and a stainless ring engraved with initials. Cole Barrett, 24, bass. 3 more bags open to tailored suits. The stitching is European. The watches are high-end, corroded but legible. There are no driver's licenses, only fragments of embossed cards from defunct shell companies. The 6th bag holds no body. It holds seat cushions, a headset, and a pistol magazine wrapped in fabric. Evidence technicians move through the airframe with lamps and cameras. They point at a missing ELT bracket. One notes tool marks on the mount and chafed insulation by the aft door frame. Another logs a parachute-grade fiber snagged inside a panel seam. The autopilot selector, set when power died, is fixed toward open water. A plastic placard near the cockpit shows last service in early August 1983. The pilot's seat belt is cut. No pilot is present among the dead. Agent Park gathers the families in a conference room. She explains what the wreck tells them and what it does not. The inward fractures suggest pressure change without explosive spall. The closed door suggests no forced opening at depth. Cold, low-oxygen water slowed decomposition. Ballistic screening will be discreet. No details today. The room exhales as one. Ruth raises her hand. She asks for one specific answer. Was Aidan among the 6? The agent meets her eyes and answers with care. No. Aidan Cross is not here. Marco Reyes, 21 in 1983, lead guitar, is not here either. that absence is not proof of life. It is the removal of a false death. The press arrives late and loud. The families are shielded behind barricades. Even so, microphones bloom over the rail as the crane swings the fuselage onto cradles. A reporter recites names into a lens. Ruth looks away. The Navy team catalogues cabin damage. Seat backs show scrape angles consistent with a struggle. Floor scuffs run toward the forward bulkhead. A single cartridge casing sits wedged below a track. The captain logs it and drops it into a paper bag with fresh gloves. A camera flashes. The casing's head stamp is recorded. Agent Park notices the suit jackets share a smudge at the cuff. She flags it for GSR testing. The pathologist marks punctures on shirts as entry points and notes fibers that must be matched later. A logistics officer opens a crate labeled with coordinates and time stamps. Every label leads forward to a lab and a chain of custody. Ruth steps outside and watches the river. She keeps her notes in her pocket and checks the time again. The first call came at 2:10 p.m. The last clear image of her son is from a roll of film shot at the Troutdale ramp. He is grinning. He is holding a boarding pass. He is walking toward a door that would be locked for 19 years. Questions move in like fog. Ruth knows her son wrote a fragment of a lyric that summer. He played it once in the kitchen. Only she heard it. That memory, useless for decades, now feels like a key. She decides to say nothing about it. Not yet. She writes 2 names on the edge of a brochure and circles them. She underlines the pilot's name from the charter manifest. Then she folds the page and calls her doctor to postpone an appointment. She tells herself she will sleep tonight. She knows she will not sleep. 2 bodies are named, 3 are not, and 1 seat stayed empty. Who walked off this story before the plane reached the bottom? Agent Lena Park rebuilt the last day in clean lines. August 14, 1983, 5:41 p.m., Troutdale ramp. The charter captain filed a local VFR loop with a westbound segment over the coast. Wheels up at 6:32 p.m. Portland approach tracked the jet to 6:45 p.m., altitude 9,500 feet. At 6:47 p.m., radio silence. No mayday. The transponder code remained 1200. The track bled off toward open water. A duty controller from that night still worked in Vancouver. Park recorded his memory at 3:10 p.m., March 5, 2002. He remembered a ghost return that jolted north, then faded. He circled the time stamp. The movement would match a quick heading change toward a pre-selected point. If the pilot wanted radar cover, he hugged altitude and departed the plan. The Cascadia Basin was the final canvas. Technicians opened the aft service panel. A short nylon strand sat trapped under a bent screw tab. It was not cabin fabric. It matched parachute-grade webbing under microscopy. The panel showed prying marks. A second strand appeared inside the door track. The latch itself carried fresh tool scoring under paint. The ELT mount was bare. Copper traces around the harness cut were clean, like it had been removed before power loss. Park pulled the charter manifest. The pilot of record was Thomas "Tom" Vickers, 34 in 1983. No body was recovered that matched him. His FAA file showed a suspension in 1981 for falsified log entries. A 1982 reinstatement came with a reprimand. He reported no foreign travel. His bank history ended in late August 1983. Nothing after. The 3 suited men gained names by teeth and screws. Dental records connected them to an import company with 2 Oregon shell addresses. Their passports, found in a safety case, used aliases. Forensics lifted primer residue from their cuffs and shirt plackets. The clothing carried close-range stippling. That detail narrowed the fight to within a few feet of the muzzles. There was a pistol magazine in the cabin debris, but no pistol. Park briefed the families in a guarded room. She did not dramatize. She laid out times, objects, and lines of travel. She confirmed Aidan and Marco were not among the dead. She confirmed the pilot's absence. A state trooper asked the question that sat in the air. Why no debris? The metal had not fractured across a wide field. The aircraft settled in one piece. 19 years of cold water preserved more than anyone expected. Ruth listened, eyes on the table. She did not interrupt. When asked later, she gave one new fact. Her son had been asked to perform for foreign distributors that week. Martin set the meeting. She had not seen a contract. She had not seen a check. She remembered a camera in Martin's hands on the ramp. He took pictures of the jet and the band. He kept the prints. The police had copies from 1983. Park's team rebuilt the last minutes in a narrow corridor. A forward struggle left heel rakes in the carpet. A seatback scrape showed weight pushing toward the cockpit. Someone tried to stand during a turn or a drop. A single casing under a track suggested one shot on the cabin side. The pathologist's early note of 2 close-range entries on a shirt suggested more at the front. The missing pistol meant the shooter kept his weapon or tossed it before impact. The FAA archive provided radar coverage maps from summer 1983. The line west of the Columbia showed gaps beyond a certain range and altitude. If the pilot dropped low and kept going, ground returns fell apart. A fishing vessel radio log from that night surfaced from a Newport attic. It had been boxed for years. The owner's son handed it over at 6:20 p.m. It recorded faint engine noise and a flashing object southwest of Cascade Head at roughly 7:10 p.m. The coordinates were approximate, but the timing matched. Park signed the paperwork to elevate the matter. The case moved from missing persons to homicide with federal jurisdiction. Evidence tags multiplied. The pistol magazine went into a clean bag. The fiber strands went into separate envelopes. The belt buckles and guitar strap remained with the pathologist for controlled photo IDs. The chain of custody walked in pairs. She scheduled a sit-down with Martin at 9 a.m. the following day. He had refused the evening slot. He agreed to the morning with counsel. Ruth did not ask to attend. She had another task. She planned to scan the old photo envelopes and date the backs by handwriting. She would mark who stood where and who carried what. The press kept shouting outside the gate. Park kept the room locked and the language careful. She did one thing the cameras could not see. She slid a sign-up card across the table and told viewers to follow updates as evidence moved. If people wanted more cases handled with dates, places, and proof, they could subscribe and keep the pressure on. Quiet support mattered when attention shifted elsewhere. At 8:03 p.m. she stood on the pier and watched the hull drip. She made a short list in a black notebook. Pilot missing. Weapon missing. 2 musicians unaccounted for. 1 radio drift north at 6:47 p.m. 1 fishing log at 7:10 p.m. She closed the book. Ruth left under escort and said nothing to the cameras. She stared at the river that had carried secrets out to sea. She gripped a small paper with 2 names written and circled. Then she looked up at the dark sky and decided what to do next. Someone else had kept the pilot's seat warm that night. March 6, 2002, 11:18 a.m., Newport, Oregon. Ruth Cross left her cardiology clinic on Southwest 9th Street with a follow-up card in her purse. She planned to bus across town, then call agent Lena Park with a small detail about Martin's ramp photos. The sidewalk was busy. A man waited by the curb in a faded jacket and jeans. He watched her, not the traffic. She turned toward the stop at Northwest Coast Street. The man stepped into her path and spoke in a flat tone. He said a line Aidan wrote in the summer of 1983. He said it exactly, word for word. It was a lyric Ruth heard once in her kitchen. Aidan never performed it. She froze and looked for a badge. There was none. The man told her to keep walking. He kept a hand inside his jacket. Ruth moved to the bus shelter's far bench and dialed a number she knew by memory. The man sat down 6 feet away and repeated the lyric quietly. He told her to end the call. He said accidents happen to mothers who talk. A bus for the hospital pulled in. He stood, blocked the door, then let others pass. He told her to take the next one. At 11:29 a.m., a dark sedan rolled to the curb. The rear door opened. A driver with a buzz cut looked straight ahead. The man in the faded jacket told Ruth to get in. She refused and raised her voice. He stepped closer and pressed something hard against her coat under her ribs. She got in. The locks clicked and the car pulled into traffic. They crossed the Yaquina Bay Bridge and headed south on Highway 101. No one spoke. Ruth kept her eyes on mile markers. South Beach. Ona Beach. Walled Port. The car turned inland onto a forest road without a sign. The surface turned to dirt and rock. After 12 minutes, a small cabin came into view. The sedan stopped behind a delivery truck with Oregon plates and a dented bumper. Inside the cabin, the man produced tape and plastic. He did not explain much. He gave curt orders. He told Ruth to swallow for small, wrapped items. He handed her 2 tablets and a paper cup of water. He said the medication would help the packages remain intact. Ruth told him she had a heart condition. He did not care. He said this was a message and a test. He warned her not to talk to police about the wreck or the lyric. He taped her wrists and waited until her swallowing reflex slowed. He timed her with a cheap digital watch. At 12:12 p.m., the delivery truck's rear door rolled up. The cabin's man called out in Spanish. 2 men answered from the cargo bay. They helped move Ruth to the truck. The cargo area was clean. A panel on the left wall swung inward to reveal a hidden compartment. The space was tight and dark. She saw adults inside, mostly women. No one spoke. The panel shut and the latch clicked. The engine started. The drive took hours. No windows, no air vent she could see, only scenes of light and the thrum of tires. Once, the truck stopped at a way station and moved on. Another time, she heard a dog bark and someone banged the main cargo door. The inner panel stayed shut. Ruth counted breaths and forced herself not to panic. She thought of the lyric and why a stranger had it. She also thought of the pilot's name and the clean cut on the ELT harness. By late afternoon, the truck backed into a warehouse. The hidden door opened. Bright lights hit her eyes. The men ordered everyone out by pointing and short commands. Block letters on a steel beam read Salem Industrial. She saw pallet jacks, drums, and a small room marked with an X-ray warning sticker. A guard scanned each person with a wand and checked wrists. The process was quick and impersonal. The language shifted to accented English and Russian. Ruth was separated and marched down a hallway. The concrete floor was cold through her shoes. Her hand shook, but her voice stayed low. A supervisor with a bent nose looked her over and swore. He asked why they sent an old one who could not stand straight. He told an assistant to process 3 other women in another room. Ruth heard a door close behind them. She heard nothing else. A tall man entered from the far end and spoke to the supervisor in a quiet voice. He wore a dark jacket and kept his hands open and visible. He looked at Ruth, then at the transport log. He told the supervisor he would take her upstairs for verification. He produced a badge that looked internal, not law enforcement. The supervisor shrugged and waved them on. In a freight elevator, the tall man spoke for the first time. He gave his name calmly. Marco Reyes. He did not touch Ruth. He told her to keep her head down and follow his steps. She recognized the name and lost her breath. He pressed the door close button and covered the camera with his sleeve for 2 seconds. The elevator stopped on the 2nd floor and opened onto an office corridor. They walked past empty desks and a glassed conference room with maps. Marco used a keycard and 2 codes to open a heavier door. Inside was a smaller office with a metal file cabinet and a phone. He locked the door and turned to Ruth. He said the lyric again and asked if she understood its use. She nodded and asked where Aidan was. Marco said he was nearby. He said they had little time and too many ears. He led her to a final door with a different lock. He knocked 3 times, paused, and knocked twice. The lock clicked. Ruth stepped forward and saw who stood waiting for her. March 6, 2002, 6:04 p.m., Salem Industrial Park. The office door opened from inside after Marco's coded knocks. Ruth stepped in and stopped. Aidan Cross stood behind a metal desk with a phone, a file drawer, and a wall clock. He was thinner than in the ramp photos. His hair was shorter. His eyes were alert and sweeping the corners of the room. He said her name once and told her to keep her voice down. He warned that the walls were wired for internal monitoring. Ruth asked if he had been here for years. Aidan said he moved between sites under orders. He said names quickly and without drama. Anatoly Chernov controlled the West Coast side. Diego Carvalho ran a competing channel through Mid-Valley freight yards. The wreck changed pressure inside the organization. People feared audits, seizures, and informants. Diego wanted a fast takeover tonight. Aidan pointed to a vent and told Ruth to stay away from it. He asked Marco for the building's headcount and shift rotations. Marco recited numbers. 21 men across 2 floors. 3 in the radio room. 2 at the side dock. A locked room on the lower level with a furnace unit labeled with a service tag. Ruth did not ask what happened there. Aidan said the unit would be sealed by morning if they survived the night. He turned to Ruth and spoke like an operations brief. She would leave with a federal escort if they could hold one hallway for 15 minutes. He told her not to mention the lyric to anyone but Agent Park. He said the lyric was the only way to verify him against a double. He said doubles existed in this world. Footsteps hit the corridor at 6:11 p.m. Aidan signaled Marco to the side and raised a hand for quiet. A knock came, heavy and fast. A voice with a Pacific Northwest accent spoke through the door. "Open up. We consolidate now." A second voice said another name. "Diego wants the books and the keys." Aidan moved Ruth behind the file cabinet. He pressed a button on the desk phone and dialed without looking. He let it ring once and hung up. It was a silent alarm line to another office. The lock turned from outside. The door opened. 3 men entered with pistols low. The first was Diego Carvalho. He wore a dark shirt with rolled sleeves and an internal badge clipped at the belt. He looked at Aidan and then at Ruth. He smiled without warmth. He told Aidan the old rules ended at sundown. He said Chernov was leaving Oregon tonight, one way or another. He said they could have a future if they signed now. Aidan asked for terms. Diego said the tour company would relaunch after a cooling period. Money would move through venues again. Aidan would manage the civic side. He would not touch product. Marco would keep rosters clean. Ruth would be escorted home and told to be quiet. It sounded rehearsed. Aidan asked if the Coast Guard had been paid attention. Diego laughed and said the river only saw what it was told. Ruth moved her hand toward the phone. Diego saw the angle change and lifted his pistol. Aidan stepped between them and held his palms out. He told Ruth to stop. He told Diego there was no need to escalate. Diego told Aidan to move. He took 1 step closer. Ruth grabbed the handset and hit redial. The line opened. She said her name and the location. A gunshot cracked the room at 6:14 p.m. Aidan staggered and went down on his right knee. He pressed a hand to his chest and tried to stand. Marco moved fast. He drove Diego's firing arm aside and stripped the weapon with a wrist turn. He shoved Diego into the second man and fired twice center mass from Diego's own gun. He pivoted and fired once at the third man's shoulder to break aim. The rounds were grouped and controlled. The third man dropped his pistol and slid down the frame. Marco kicked the weapons away and grabbed the desk phone. He gave the address, building letter, and floor. He said federal agent en route, officer down scenario, civilian injured. He identified himself and gave his birth year. He said the line could be recorded. He dropped the phone and locked the door with the deadbolt and chair. He pulled a towel from the drawer and pressed it to Aidan's wound. He told Ruth to apply steady pressure and keep talking to keep Aidan conscious. Siren sounded faint at 6:18 p.m. Aidan spoke in short phrases. He said the wreck forced Diego's hand. He said Chernov would cut ties and run south before midnight. He said the pilot who set autopilot in 1983 had a new name and a new passport. He said the pilot had visited this building once for a payroll pickup. Ruth memorized every word and time stamp. Footfalls hit the stairwell. Shouts in mixed English and Russian echoed from the lower floor. A clatter of metal dropped near the dock. The building alarm began to pulse. Marco slid the file cabinet against the door. He checked the pistol's magazine and breathed once. He did not promise anything. He laid out a path to the side stair and the service alley if the front was compromised. At 6:22 p.m., a different knock hit the door. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 taps. Marco looked at Aidan and nodded. Aidan nodded back. Marco moved the cabinet 3 inches and kept his aim steady. He asked for the caller's full name and role. The reply came clear. Lena Park, FBI. Tactical is 2 minutes out. Do not open unless we say a north gate. Ruth lifted the towel and saw fresh red. She pressed back down and counted to 10, then started again. She told Aidan to stay awake and focus on the clock. She heard tires outside and boots hit concrete. She heard radios snap and a battering ram strike a far door. She did not move. Someone still had the pilot's name and wanted it buried. Paramedics rolled Aidan into Salem Hospital's emergency bay at 6:41 p.m. He was pale, conscious for seconds at a time, and losing blood. A trauma nurse cut his shirt and marked the entry point. A respiratory tech set oxygen and called out vitals. A surgeon signed consent and pushed him through double doors. Ruth waited against the wall with dried blood on her hands. An officer took her name, time of abduction, and the cabin location south of Waldport. He logged each answer and read it back for accuracy. At 7:05 p.m., a triage nurse moved Ruth to a quiet room. She explained the recovery protocol for the forswallowed packages. A physician's assistant recorded a brief cardiac history and medications. Ruth was monitored for arrhythmias, then escorted to a controlled evidence collection suite. The process was clinical and slow. Each item was retrieved intact, placed in separate bags, and sealed with time and initials. A detective photographed every step without showing Ruth's face. The chain of custody form filled line by line. Agent Lena Park arrived at 7:42 p.m. Marco had been held in an interview room and cleared of immediate charges pending review. His hands were swabbed for primer residue. His clothing was bagged. He made a recorded statement and requested counsel. He remained calm and specific with times. He identified Diego Carvalho, described the layout of the Salem facility, and named the lower-leveled furnace room. He gave 2 nicknames for guards and the call sign used on handheld radios. He described a payroll pickup by a pilot with a healed scar near the jaw. Park briefed Ruth in a small conference space. Her tone stayed flat and careful. She laid out the 1983 sequence in a straight line. Martin cross-scheduled a celebration flight from Troutdale. He promised meetings with foreign distributors in Portland that night. On board, an argument escalated when Cole refused to sign a touring addendum. Jamie tried for the radio. Gunfire followed. The pilot, Thomas Tom Vickers, set autopilot for open water and exited low with support from a vessel west of Cascade Head. Park added new findings. A safety case from the wreck contained 3 passports with matching dental IDs to the suited men. The pages bore identical entry stamps from Vancouver, British Columbia, the week before the flight. GSR tests on cuffs, lapels, and shirt plackets came back positive. The pistol magazine recovered in the cabin debris matched a commercial model common in the early 1980s. A single brass casing found under a seat track carried a head stamp still legible. Ballistics would compare lands and grooves if a weapon surfaced. Then Park made a move no camera would capture. She slid Ruth a photocopy of a storage unit inventory seized that afternoon in Gresham under warrant. The unit belonged to a shell company tied to Martin. Inside were banned merch boxes, duplicate ledgers, and a folder marked travel cash. One photo showed Martin on a ramp in 1983 shaking hands with a man who looked like Vickers. The print was dated with lab stamps from a 1-hour photo kiosk in Portland. Ruth asked one question. Was Martin under arrest? Park said yes. He had been taken into custody at 5:58 p.m. at his house, with counsel present. Charges were preliminary and included conspiracy, money laundering, and homicide counts pending autopsy reports. A judge would see him in the morning. Park did not comment on Martin's past psychiatric commitments. She said only that the state would test claims against the paper trail. Hospital security escorted Ruth to the ICU anteroom at 9:03 p.m. Aidan lay behind glass with monitors steadying his numbers. A nurse adjusted a line and told Ruth the basics. He had lost significant blood. He was sedated and ventilated. The next 12 hours would matter. Ruth wrote the times on a folded brochure. She added 2 names and circled them, Vickers and Chernov. At 9:40 p.m., Park stepped out to take a call from the Salem scene commander. The warehouse was secure. A downstairs room contained an industrial incinerator, a decontamination shower, and a sealed locker with ledgers. Digital rosters listed first names, dates, and weights next to route codes. A stack of vendor invoices matched shell entities tied to the 3 suited men. A locked door off the radio room held a shortwave set and a file with coastal coordinates. One set of coordinates tracked close to the 7:10 p.m. fishing log entry from August 14, 1983. Marco asked for a deal. He offered floor maps, names, and supply routes. He cited the payroll pickup by a pilot using the alias Victor T. He described a scar under the ear and a habit of rubbing the left jaw when thinking. He said Vickers had visited the Salem office twice, both times for envelopes, not meetings. Park wrote it all down and had him sign each page. Near 10, a lab tech called with a small break. The nylon strands from the plane's aft panel matched webbing used in a line of emergency parachutes sold through a Tacoma outfitter in 1982 to 1984. The store had changed owners. The old receipts were in storage but salvageable. Park sent a team north. Ruth returned to the waiting chair and watched the ICU clock. She held the lyric in her head and kept it there. She did not share it with staff. She would use it once, and only with Park, when Aidan could speak. A phone rang down the hall with a tone she had not heard yet tonight. It was the kind of tone that precedes a name. By morning, the Salem warehouse was a grid of evidence tents and numbered flags. At 8:10 a.m., March 7, 2002, Agent Lena Park walked Ruth through what could be shared. Aidan had survived surgery. He remained sedated and ventilated. Vitals were stable but fragile. Marco was under guard in a secure room 2 floors down. He had signed a proffer. He would stay in county custody until a federal hold arrived. Search teams moved in parallel. One team catalogued the downstairs furnace room. They logged ash samples, metal grates, and a service tag with a phone number traced to a shuttered contractor in Coiza. Another team cleared the radio room. They seized a shortwave set, a binder of call signs, and a folder of coastal coordinates. A printout showed 7:10 p.m. the 14th of August, 83, penciled near a set of numbers west of Cascade Head. That matched the fishing log recovered from the attic in Newport. At 9:22 a.m., a warrant team hit a Gresham storage unit tied to Martin Cross's shell company. They found banned merch, ledgers, and a sealed envelope marked travel cash. Inside were receipts from a Tacoma outfitter that sold emergency parachutes in 1982 and 1983. The nylon fibers from the plane's aft panel matched that product line under microscopy. The outfitter had changed owners twice, but a banker's box of old carbon copies sat in a back office. Park sent 2 agents to retrieve it and to pull customer names. Martin was arraigned at 10:30 a.m. in Multnomah County on preliminary counts. The homicide enhancements would be added after autopsy reports finalized wound paths. The prosecutor argued for no bail, citing flight risk and the interstate scope. Defense counsel argued his prior psychiatric history. The judge held him without bail for 48 hours pending a detention hearing. Park watched from the back and took notes on counsel's timeline. She underlined the phrase "celebration flight" every time it was used. By noon, Ruth was in a witness room with a victim advocate. She signed entry into a temporary protection plan. Her address would be masked in filings. Transport would be handled by deputies. She would use a new phone. She asked, again, if she could see Aiden. The advocate checked with the ICU. A nurse agreed to 5 minutes with a respirator nurse present. Ruth nodded and folded her hands. She did not mention the lyric to anyone. At 1:14 p.m., a Coast Guard patrol north of Brookings reported a human-made frame tangled in kelp 2 miles offshore. The frame was thin and corroded. A crewman photographed stamped hardware before it sank in a swell. The photos were sharp enough to read a partial serial. Park forwarded the images to the Tacoma Records box team. A handwritten log card listed 3 frames with adjacent numbers. One buyer used a Portland P.O. box and paid cash in July 1983. Marco continued to talk. He mapped drop points, meeting times, and the flow of cash. He described a payroll pickup by a man calling himself Victor T. He noted a scar under the left jaw and a slight rub at the scar before signing documents. He had seen the man twice in late 2001. Park cross-checked DMV photos. She pulled a 1983 license image for Thomas Vickers and compared chin lines and ear shape. She marked a possible match and flagged it for a facial review unit. Evening brought more paper. A ledger from the Salem office listed venue promotions beside cash amounts that matched dates on Martin's Gresham ledgers. The names of the 3 suited men from the plane appeared as payees on 2 transfers. Lab results on their clothing showed primer residue at the cuffs and collar edges. The pathologist's interim notes recorded close-range entry on 2 and a contact transfer pattern on a 3rd. The pistol magazine from the wreck matched a model sold widely in 1983, the casing head stamp still lined up with an ammunition lot that could narrow purchase windows if a receipt surfaced. Park set expectations plainly. Prosecutors would argue coercion for Aiden and Marco if they cooperated fully. Cooperation meant dates, routes, and names without omission. It meant testifying. It meant living under protection. Ruth listened and wrote the time on the brochure again. She circled Vickers's name and drew an arrow to Victor T. By March 12, 2002, federal indictments named Anatoly Chernov, 3 lieutenants, and Diego Carvalho's estate. Chernov had fled Oregon. A task force sent detainers to ports of entry and notified Interpol. A sealed count named Thomas V, aka Victor T, as a material participant. The affidavit attached radar maps, parachute receipts, and the coordinate sheet from the Salem radio room. A judge signed the warrants. Weeks became months. In May 2002, the Tacoma receipts were matched to the partial serial photographed off Brookings. In July, a hidden account in Vancouver, British Columbia, showed a cash deposit in late August 1983 linked to a P.O. box near Troutdale. A letter carrier remembered rent paid in cash and a man who signed as Victor. The case file thickened. Ruth visited the ICU every permitted hour. Monitors marked Aiden's progress. He opened his eyes once in late summer, then slept again with a nurse's hand on his shoulder. Park waited to ask the lyric, and so did Ruth. They would protect that key until he could answer under oath. In 2004, juries read the ledgers, heard the logs, and saw the maps. Paper closed what water had hidden for 19 years. One name, though, stayed outside the courtroom doors with a scar under the jaw and a cash-paid parachute.